Don't forget to go to AshKicking.com for pound the best home health and beauty fragrance products.
Hi, you're watching Dante's Boxing Nation. Woo!
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So despite the walls closing in on Gennady Golovkin, Triple G, he just recently said that he has a much bigger and stronger record than Bernard Hopkins. Matter of fact, let me go ahead and quote exactly what Triple G had to say. I feel like a star, because just if you check Bernard's opponents probably, you understand that my record is much bigger and much stronger. Bigger. This is a good situation for me, for my career, and for my fans. Of course, that's it. Let me just start with saying this. You know, I would expect something like this to come out of Abel Sanchez's mouth. Golovkin's trainer, I would expect him to say that. This surprises me that Gennady Golovkin actually said this. So Gennady Golovkin, he says that in terms of opponents, he has a much bigger, much stronger record than Bernard Hopkins does. For those of you guys who don't know, with this Vanes Martirosyan fight, Gennady Golovkin, he will tie Bernard Hopkins' record when it comes to middleweight defenses or title defenses. Boy, where do I start? There's so much to say about this, I don't know where to start. You know, let's start with the Vanes Martirosyan situation. It is important to note that Gennady Golovkin, he has a number one contender that he's supposed to be facing. And in fact, the IBF, they're threatening to strip him of his title if he doesn't fight his mandatory by August 3rd. When you think about the fact that Golovkin is going to get credit for tying up the record with Bernard Hopkins when it comes to title defenses, and he's doing it against an opponent that he handpicked, that's not even a middleweight, hasn't fought in 2 years, and is coming off of a loss, when he could have easily fought the number one, the number two, or the number three contender at the middleweight division. Instead, he's fighting against a guy who's not even ranked in the middleweight division. And that's supposed to count as a title defense to tie the record with Bernard Hopkins. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Now let's talk about the contrast. Let's make the comparison when it comes to who does have the strongest resume. I want people to understand this. When it comes to Felix Tito Trinidad alone as one of Bernard Hopkins' opponents, by way of contrast, Felix Trinidad, he was not only undefeated when Bernard Hopkins faced him, but he was the favorite to annihilate Bernard Hopkins. That's right. Trinidad was expected to go in there and destroy Hopkins, just like Tyson was expected to go in there and destroy Buster Douglas. This was the odds, because at the time, Trinidad was a wrecking ball. Trinidad, he had just moved up to junior middleweight, and he fought in a tournament, and it was a real tournament. He fought in a tournament where he had to fight against fellow champions, other junior middleweight champions like the undefeated Olympian, gold medalist Olympian, David Reed. Undefeated fighter, Trinidad knocked him out. Then he had to fight against the undefeated Fernando Vargas, knocked him out. Trinidad then moved up to middleweight, participated in a tournament there where he knocked out the very talented William Joppy. After he knocked out William Joppy, the majority of the boxing world, they were pretty much convinced that Trinidad would do the same thing to Bernard Hopkins. And as you guys see in these images right here, it turned out to be the contrary. Bernard Hopkins became the first fighter to put an L on Trinidad's record and stop him. Now, there's no doubt when it comes to Gennady Golovkin, Triple G's biggest win on his record is against Danny Jacobs. There's no doubt about it, right? Because the Canelo Alvarez fight was a draw. This is the biggest win that he has on his resume. But the problem is, if we're comparing him to Bernard Hopkins, and once again, we can use tons of examples of different, because Bernard Hopkins, he fought so many tough challengers at 160. But when it comes to just this comparison of comparing Danny Jacobs as an opponent to Felix Trinidad as an opponent, let's break down a dichotomy. When it comes to Felix Trinidad, number one, Trinidad was the favorite. He was the favorite in that fight. He was favored to not only win, but knock out Bernard Hopkins, number one. Now, Danny Jacobs, on the other end, he was the underdog. He was a massive underdog going into the Gennady Golovkin fight. Why? Because Danny Jacobs had already been knocked out before. Once again, going back to the contrast, compared to Felix Trinidad, who was undefeated. He had never lost. He had never been knocked out before. Okay? So, because Danny Jacobs had been knocked out before, people expected Golovkin to go in there and annihilate him. Because the consensus is, if someone else has already knocked out Danny Jacobs, as good as Golovkin is, he certainly is going to knock out Danny Jacobs. That was the assumption of many. In fact, you had fans, you had Golovkin fans. They were giving Danny Jacobs no chance at all. He's going to get knocked out. The bum has no chin. This is what they were saying. He has no chin, this and this and this. So everything the Golovkin fans said was corroborating with the odds. They gave the man no chance. Okay? But now all of a sudden, when this guy who supposedly didn't have a chin and wasn't that good, he was overrated, whatever, despite all of this, he goes in there and gives Gennady Golovkin such a difficult fight that a lot of people think that he actually won the fight. Now all of a sudden, the same fans that said that this man had no chin and this is going to be an easy win for Golovkin, now all of a sudden they're trying to praise Golovkin for beating Danny Jacobs. Regardless if you call it a win or not, it is a W on Golovkin's record. So now they're giving him credit for getting this win over Danny Jacobs, and now trying to say, oh, you say he hasn't fought anyone, he fought Danny Jacobs. That's not how they were talking about Danny Jacobs before the fight. Okay? Now there are so many big names that Bernard Hopkins beat at the middleweight division. And a lot of those fighters he beat, they were undefeated. Unlike a lot of Golovkin's opponents who had been knocked out before, they had been beat multiple times. No, Bernard Hopkins, a lot of his opponents, they were undefeated. Fighters that you probably never even heard of if you weren't following the sport like me. When he beat Joe Lipsy. Joe Lipsy was an undefeated knockout artist. He was one of Bernard Hopkins' mandatories. Bernard Hopkins knocked him out. Joe Lipsy, he had all type of vicious knockout highlights on Tuesday night fights back in the day. Okay? Glenn Johnson, the Road Warrior. Bernard Hopkins beat him when he was undefeated. Bernard Hopkins, he fought Roy Jones when Roy Jones was undefeated in a very competitive match. Okay? Bernard Hopkins, he was beaten by Antoine Eccles, Robert Allen, Felix Tito Trinidad, once again, Joe Lipsy. And I'm not even mentioning them all. Now, when it comes to Felix Trinidad in general, I truly believe Trinidad, well, I won't even say I believe, it's a fact. Trinidad would have been a nightmare. His style would have been a Golovkin. And I would pick Trinidad, the prime Trinidad, to stop Gennady Golovkin. With Trinidad's height, the fact that Trinidad was tall, but he had the ability to fight on the outside or the inside. And he would break you down. He was one of those walls that continue to close in. And the thing is, if Golovkin were to fight a Trinidad, Golovkin would not be fighting a smaller fighter, or he wouldn't be that much smaller. Because Trinidad, he carried his weight to the middleweight division. So you have a very technically sound, aggressive, accurate puncher in Tito Trinidad. A guy who can box a little bit and he can fight on the inside. That would have been a nightmare for Golovkin. And once again, you guys have to remember, when you look at the biggest names on Golovkin's resume, his record, those were controversial decisions he had with those big names. Canelo Alvarez, the fight was a draw. Danny Jacobs, a lot of people think Danny Jacobs won the fight. When it comes to Bernard Hopkins defining wins, there was no question on who won the fight. Right? Against Trinidad, against Joe Lipsy, against all them names that I mentioned. So when it comes to Gennady Golovkin, here's the thing. If Gennady Golovkin continued to fight the Vanes Monterosians in the division, if he continued to fight the Adamas, the Wades, etc., then he could break all the title defense records in the world. But is he going to get credit for it? I mean, if that's the case, Golovkin could be the first fighter to have 100 title defenses if it's against Vanes Monterosian. But that does nothing for his legacy. It does nothing for his legacy. Like I said, if you cannot compare fighters like Joe Lipsy, Glenn Johnson, Roy Jones Jr., Antoine Echols. You can't compare those fighters to, and even Trinidad. You can't compare those fighters to, or you cannot compare Golovkin's opponents to those fighters. You can't compare the Dominic Wades, the Adamas, the Marco Antonio Rubios. Once again, when it was time for Golovkin to step up, he struggled against the best competition. When Bernard Hopkins stepped up in competition, he shined. And he beat these fighters decisively. Okay? So you can't make the comparison. You cannot make the comparison. There's no way Gennady Golovkin has a much stronger, bigger, in his words, record than Bernard.